Welcome to the Awakening Together channel here on YouTube. This is one of our live Satsangs that take place in our sanctuary. If you want more information about our community, Awakening Together, then please visit our website, which is awakening-together.org. Enjoy the Satsang. This time with Akilesh Ayyar.
Good afternoon, everybody, or evening it is now, on the East Coast at least. Welcome to our monthly guest satsang interview. Akilesh, we didn't get a chance to do a sound test, so maybe if you would speak, we can make sure sound's all functioning.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Perfect. Yay, thank you. Perfect. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Very close. So it's Akilesh.
Akilesh.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm just gonna bring everybody into a description of your background, and then we're just gonna ask some questions and see where the night takes us. Sound like a plan?
That sounds perfect.
Perfect. All right. So for those of you who haven't heard of Akilesh before, he is a spiritual mentor and writer who's been engaged with the Hindu school of Advaita Vedanta, which is non-duality, for over 20 years. He specializes in the interpretation of Sri Ramana Maharshi's ideas as a path to ultimate truth and liberation. He's written 2 books on self-realization, and one of the books is called How to Find What Isn't Lost. Love that title, thank you. And the other book is more recently is called Spiritual Dialogues with Akilesh, Q&A on Liberation and Truth. Akilesh is a graduate from Carnegie-Mellon University. He is also got a degree from the Harvard Law School and the City University of New York. So well studied. We've got a couple of Harvard lawyers in our audience too. What is it about this path that keeps attracting these Harvard lawyers? I keep wanting to ask that question. Anyway, he's taught and presented at Science and Nonduality, the Nothing Conference, InciteSeminars, HealHaus, Maha Rose, the New York Self-Inquiry Group, amongst other places. And his website, should you want to learn more about Akilesh, has been posted in the chat by Sina. Thank you, Sina. It is siftingtothetruth.com. So thank you. So I'm gonna just make a big fat assumption that maybe people don't know that much about you, Akilesh, and I would love it if you would just give us a little bit about what drew you to this whole becoming a spiritual mentor, teacher, non-duality path. How did you get here?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Rhoda and Sina and Lynn, and so much for having me. And I'm very honored and pleased to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you all. Yeah, so, it's funny because that question, how did I get drawn to this path is, I feel like I have at this point a sort of standard answer, and who knows how true that answer actually is, or is it really just sort of a narrative I've put together, now it's become sort of the set story in my mind, but, sort of what I have, so I will share it with you all. And basically, I think from a very early age, probably, below the age of 10 even, I was drawn to God and the spiritual. And, there's something about I remember even at the age of 6 or 7, I was there was a phase where I was really into the worship of the god Shiva. And I would do these little rituals. It only lasted like maybe a few months, but I really did enjoy it. And then sort of fell away for some reason. But over the years, I have a lot of family in India. That's my ethnicity. I grew up born and brought up in the US, but, a lot of extended family there. And I visited India many times. And so as the sort of years went by, I remember asking various people about, sort of questions about like the meaning of life and things like that, and mostly getting pretty uninspiring answers. Like one thing that always sticks in my mind is I remember this one teacher in whose, I went with a family member to this one teacher, and I asked something like, oh, well, if there's karma, then what was the first life like? If everything is result karma, what about the first life? And his response was, and now I think it's actually, maybe it was a matter of mistranslation or something like that, because I think it may sound harsher than he meant it to, but he said something like, such questions should not be asked, or something like that. And it really turned me off, So, like many people, I think, interested in spirituality at some point or another, or religion, or however you want to call it, I sort of went then through sort of a little atheist phase. But when I was in high school, I remember being, getting really kind of existentially depressed. And the truth is, I think now, seeing it, it wasn't just existential depression. I think it was partly existential depression, but it was probably also a lot of other unresolved issues from childhood, and that sort of manifested that way. But there is an old kind of cliche, but I think it's absolutely true, nevertheless, that when the student is ready, the teacher will come. And that is admittedly how it happened with me, because at that time, which was a real low point emotionally for me in like 10th grade or something like that, my mother hosted a Swami who came to the United States for the first time. So he's staying at our house, and I started asking him, for some reason, some of these same questions I'd asked others. But unlike the others, he was actually willing to engage me in conversation. And, he was willing to do a real back and forth. And so I sort of grilled him for hours and hours, really hundreds of hours. He was very patient. He was from the Advaita Vedanta school of thought, which is, for those of you who don't know, Vedanta are, the Upanishadic scriptures of Hinduism, and Advaita means non-duality, which doesn't really explain very much, I know, but just FYI. And so, that's how I sort of really got into it, because I really got to, I wanted to sort of really, find the rationale for these things. And so over the years, over several years following, thereafter, that really sort of got me into things. Then what happened was, however, I sort of had the rudiments. I thought I had way more than the rudiments, but I really just had the rudiments. When I got to college, I had this whole plan for how I was going to pursue spirituality, and really it ran into a brick wall. And what was the brick wall? The brick wall was my sudden lack of motivation to do what was supposedly required to get where I wanted to go, because I suddenly found myself essentially in conflict with myself. And I was like, why am I procrastinating? This is what I want to do, isn't it? And the reality was, there were a lot of things about myself I didn't know, and I was undermining myself in 100 different ways. And so it wasn't really, I didn't realize at the time, but I had to go on a sort of long arc of a psychological journey for the next 10 or 12 years or more, to sort of figure some of that stuff out, through various relationships, through psychotherapy, and a bunch of other things. But the whole time, spirituality never left me. Around the middle of college or something like that, I did encounter Ramana Maharshi for the very first time, who, he is very much in line with Advaita Vedanta, but he has his own flavor, twist, angle on it. He is the great genius of 20th century non-duality, in my opinion, because he has taken this very sophisticated and beautiful tradition, but he's also distilled it down into this incredibly simple essence of things, in a way that nobody else has done. And so I knew he was profound when I encountered him, but I didn't understand him, basically, and I knew I didn't understand him. And so, after 10 or 12 years after that first encounter, though I was again pursuing in various ways, I didn't really understand, there's so many layers of understanding of this stuff. You think you understand it, and it's like peeling an onion, you think you get it from a very, very, you really have a very, very grainy picture of it, and it's like a Polaroid that slowly develops, So after 10, 12, 14 years of various other stuff, it turned out that I was then, by seeming coincidence, asked to teach a class on some Hindu scriptures, and I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll pick up Ramana again. I haven't seen him in a long time. And this time when I did that, suddenly I was like, oh, actually, this makes a lot more sense now. And obviously the words hadn't changed, I changed. And so that then sparked a real intense period of practice. Again, I'd been practicing in different ways throughout, on and off, but this was really, I consider this a sort of, the most intense phase of practice for about a year or so. And I felt like the lights were flickering on and off is really what it felt like. At a certain point, for lack of a better word, and with lots of asterisks, I'll add, there was clarity. Clarity dawned. And at that point, I immediately felt like, I would be in a good position to share this with others. And, I'd been thinking about it even before. I was like, as of having gone through all this myself, and, I sort of have like many angles on it. I understand the people who ask questions, because I asked 10,000 questions myself, and I understand the psychological difficulties because I underwent them myself. And I also have some training in psychology, and have dealt with psychoanalysts, and I've read. So I kind of like a bit of a jack of all trades and a lot of things that connect to or touch on spirituality. I might not be a therapist myself, but I kind of know when that might be beneficial for somebody. So anyway, this is a very long-winded way of saying, that's the point at which, though, when clarity dawned, I was like, okay, now it's time to sort of try to share this with others.
Thank you for that. Gorgeous. So you said clarity dawned, and that is just really drawing me in at this moment. So what was that like for you when clarity dawned?
Okay, so yeah, it's very tricky to say, because and I did try to express some of it at the very end of my first book. I sort of wrote this little poetic, prose poetry about it. I kind of want to say, I'm always sort of caveating what I say with respect to this, because the truth is, I think ultimately that, the truth is that the truth is unspeakable, and so, what is at some level, the quote unquote dawning of clarity is really the last gasp of unclarity, is what, in a way, the way I might put it, actually, because it's quote unquote an experience, and though it's like just on the line, right? It's just on the line between mind and not mind. And so, it's technically an experience, right? I say clarity dawned. That means I'm suggesting that prior to that, there was not clarity. And then, then there was clarity, which means that clarity is an event in time. But the truth is not an event in time. So, so there's a little bit of a paradox there, but really, Okay, now that said, I'll say a couple things. So one is that in that year of practice beforehand, I was getting what I like to call our glimpses, which became deeper and longer, which were these periods of, spaciousness and freedom, where there were seeming freedom from effort, freedom from the burden of effort. And, but it would be very frustrating because they would come and they would go. And, so it's like, so finally at some point, and I don't know why it happened at exactly that point, except I can only speculate that, because this generally is the case, that, the basic barrier to quote unquote realization is the attachments to desires and fears, the attachments to one's identity as a person, which, really desires and fears, hopes, dreams, regrets, all of those things, that constellation reinforce that identity. So when the identity is weakened because the attachments are weakened, then at a certain point, the resistance to seeing the truth weakens. When it weakens sufficiently, then there's the dam breaks, so to say. So in some sense, I'd like to say, those glimpses which I had prior were really no different than this quote unquote final glimpse, with the single exception that the attachments had now weakened sufficiently, I guess, that there is a certain finality to it, something like that, you know. But what is it? It's you know, the closest I can say is it's the mind coming to its own boundary, right? That's really what it is, right? Because the self is not knowable directly by the mind. It's not an object. The mind can only see objects, you know, and you know, the mind can see things that have limits, things that have characteristics, things that have qualities. The self is not any of those things. But the mind can come up to just about come up to seeing itself as an object. And in that moment of seeing itself as an object, it's like coming up to a fence. You come up to a fence, and when there's a fence, you know there's beyond the fence. So when the mind comes up to its own boundary, it knows that there is something more than that. It knows it as the unknowable. It knows it as the ungraspable. You know, it's in the shadow of it, you know? And so that, yeah, is as close as the mind can get, I would say, you know? And I would also say, I guess, an important aspect of it was, at least for me in that particular moment, was the sort of recognition of the, I mean, but again, see, the truth is, it probably had experienced this many times before this quote unquote last moment. But, you know, that knowledge, seeing the mind as in its quality as an image, you know, as an image, as a series of images, you know, a kind of a flatness to it, a kind of lack of depth, all surface, no depth, you know. And in that moment, I recognized, again, problem with language, I recognized, did I recognize anything? But, you know, that, you know, the entire quest had been fictional in some sense. So, yeah, I mean, this is not a very, it's not, yeah, I have hesitation saying this because, again, as I'm saying it, I'm like, this is a mental description of an event that's really not exactly mental. You can't say it's not exactly entirely unmental either, but, you know, there's something indescribable about it, obviously. So I'm describing it. And so I feel, as I describe it, that this isn't really quite correct, but, you know, I'm nevertheless making the attempt.
Fabulous. There's so many really interesting things that you just pointed to. The one that is ringing right now is you pointed to the fictional quest. You called it the fictional quest. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, because, so yeah, this is this is the great cosmic joke aspect of the quest for self-realization, right? Because there is a sense that seekers have that they, you know, they don't know what they really are, and they are seeking it, right? And, you know, this is one side of the coin that has to be admitted. It does feel like that, in a sense. But the insight that arises as a result of the quest is that the one who was fooled by the so-called ignorance of their true identity is themselves, for lack of a better word, just a thought. So, or an image, or however you want to put it. Like an analogy I use with my students pretty often because I feel like it's helpful is, you know, imagine you're reading a novel, okay? So the novel is written in the first person, or frankly, even if it's not written in the first person, right? Let's suppose it says, you know, Joe goes to the grocery store in this novel. Does anyone actually go to the grocery store? No. Nobody goes to the grocery store. This is just a set of letters on a page, you know? And if it says Joe got angry, nobody got angry. Joe is happy. Nobody's happy. Joe is wondering about the meaning of life. Nobody's wondering what the meaning of life, right? Joe goes on a spiritual quest. Nobody goes on a spiritual quest. And at the end of the spiritual quest, Joe recognizes that who he thought he was is actually just a set of letters in a book. Nobody has that recognition. All the time, there is the reader sitting outside the book who has never been fooled. The reader is reading a story about the idea of a person who is under the spell of this thing called illusion. Such a person does not actually exist. Such a person it's the idea of a person who is fooled like that. Now, this is not a perfect analogy because no analogies are perfect, and I could complicate it to make it more accurate, because I could say, really speaking, I do sometimes say this, the reader of this book is himself or herself a character in another book, and that second book has its own reader, and that reader is, again, and so on and on and on and on it goes, right? There's no actual reader outside the series. The series goes on infinitely, which is why it said in the scriptures, ignorance is, quote, anadi in Sanskrit, beginningless, so you can't find it, ignorance is really, in the end, is illusion, and illusion is magic, and magic is nothing other than the self. So, what appears, what appears to be this solid, I don't know, is actually nothing other than what's been looked for the whole time. I mean, there's something very mind-bending about this, because the mind that's trying to comprehend it is a product of it, So there's something very, very like psychedelic, for lack of a better word, about this fact. But yeah, the mind is a series of hollow containers, you might say, containing each other, Russian dolls. There's something about it which is, you look for it, and then there's something inside it, and something inside that, and something inside that, and on it goes. You don't get to the heart of it, but it's the series somehow. Not even that. You can't pin it down. But there's all you can do is gesture at it with metaphors, basically, which is what I'm doing right now. But
appreciate the metaphors. They're very, very helpful. Thank you. Before we get too much further, I neglected to open it up. Should anyone have questions, feel free to post them in the chat or raise your hand. Electronically would be helpful so they can be seen, since Akilesh is pinned here. So if anyone has questions, feel free to jump in. So that being said, so just listening to what you were saying just now, what's coming in is the attraction to Sri Ramana Maharshi. So you talked a little bit about how you made your way to him and about the profoundness of his teachings. You spoke of him, I believe the words you used were the greatest modern day philosopher. That's how it landed here, at least.
Yeah, more or less, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Lots of folks at Awakening Together, I know, also study him and are just, really appreciate that. What I was really interested in was the fact that you are doing sort of what you're calling a modern interpretation. So can you say more about that? What is the intention of that?
Sure. So, yeah, really what I mean by that, I guess I mean a couple of things. So one is, Ramana Maharshi has extracted in a way, the essence of the Advaita tradition and put it together. But I feel like it, every idea requires restating in the sort of, modern idiom, basically. And so I have attempted to take his ideas and just sort of re-clarify them for the moment, essentially. And, the way I see it is they're basically two very linked and highly complementary methods that he suggests as a sort of spear tip of the spiritual search. One is self-inquiry, and the other is surrender. And this is what I talk about in my videos, my books, and whatnot. I could even go into detail about exactly what they are, but I can tell you very, very briefly, that to sort of just give, to attempt to sort of clarify what Maharishi has really said, and in light of my own dealings with these practices, is what I mean by a modern interpretation, right? So what does inquiry mean? How can that be illustrated? How can that be dealt with? What about the obstacles, right? And the kinds of questions people have regarding inquiry or surrender, to address them as straightforwardly as it's possible to address them, So, yeah, and if I was going to say extremely briefly, what because there are different understandings. Where people read Ramana, and you'll see even in the community, if you've looked into it, how varied the interpretations are of what he means. So I'm sort of offering my own, I suppose, interpretation. And the way I view inquiry, if I'm going to say it in really 30-second soundbite, would be that sense of awareness of your own aliveness, that you are trying to locate it in your own experience, locate it. And that when you arrive at anything which you think it is, then you ask yourself, well, is this thing an object of my experience? Which almost inevitably it will be. And if it's an object, then it can't be the subject, it can't be you, because you're aware of it. It can't be that by which you are. You are and are aware of a difference between you and the object. So then what you do is you, again, essentially ask yourself, well, what's aware of this, essentially? And you don't need to use words. We use words, we say this question, who am I, or where am I, or what's aware of this? These are just prompts. But the real point is that you are trying to, in my opinion, refocus and refocus and refocus and refocus that in a kind of chase of this elusive sense of what you are. I don't believe that there is you can quote unquote simply attend to the I am, because what you think is the I am is not the I am. That in a way, that's the point. It's an object, it's a feeling that you've labeled the I am. And so to recognize that whatever it seems to be, this can't be it, and yet to keep pursuing it, because I must know how I am somehow, right? That information is coming up through me in some way. It's in my experience some wise, and to just relentlessly hunt it. That's what I would view inquiry as, And then surrender, I sort of give the instruction of, it's sort of like there's a TV on in the corner, and everything you're perceiving and thinking is on that TV. And you don't have to turn the TV off. You don't have to change the channel. You don't have to say everything is good on the TV. And you don't have to even notice everything on the TV. You just have to treat the TV as if it's essentially irrelevant. That does require, here's where there's a certain difference, I think, between people who interpret surrender. It does require effort. So I'm a big proponent for seekers of constant effort in the inquiry and the surrender, continuous, vigilant effort, until that point where the effort is not given up, but is taken from you, right? When it is no longer possible to put in effort, then effort is no longer required. But until such point as effort is taken from you, effort must be applied, preferably every waking moment, And so surrender is basically ignoring the TV and relaxing. That's how I put it. But relaxing does not necessarily mean you feel relaxed. It means you abstain from using your willpower on anything except the practice. So I'm giving a lot of information very quickly. I know I'm just giving it highly dense, condensed versions here. But this is what I mean by a modern interpretation, basically.
Yeah.
The other aspect of a modern interpretation of Ramana is that I'm also a huge proponent of a particular variety of therapy that now is a little bit out of fashion, but it's called psychoanalysis, right? And it sort of proceeds from Freud and his successors. It's come a long way since Freud. It's much more sophisticated now than it was in his time, but I do think it has the most multifaceted view of the psyche, and in my opinion, it's very, very good at helping people unknot the tangles within themselves. I'm not going to be 100%, even if it's a 10% change, it could be vital for the seeker. That kind of thing, I don't think Ramana would ever talk about psychoanalysis, it wasn't, just wasn't in his vocabulary, but I'm a big proponent of using the modern tools we have, to unwind psychological issues, because there is an intersection 100%, of course, between the psychological and the spiritual. Not the same. There's an intersection. There's a back and forth between them. So that's another aspect of it, so there's a whole mind-body connection between that and the spirit, and so to be cognizant of that would be helpful, I think, for a modern approach to spirituality.
Excellent. You said something about applying effort. Until
Yes.
effort is taken from you, I believe were the words I heard you say. Can you speak more about what applying effort looks like in the realm of surrender?
100%. So for example, in surrender, so the idea again would be you're trying to quote unquote ignore thought or ignore everything really except the practice, and to refrain from using your willpower. Now, what is willpower? Willpower means that sense of like, I am doing something in this burdensome, effortful way. Like, I'm going to determine to do something. It's not something that happens involuntarily or spontaneously, but it's like, I have decided, it feels like I've decided, basically. So the usual habits that we have are to not ignore things, but rather to engage with them, meaning in particular to allow our attention to be wholly absorbed in various events that come our way. And of course, those events prompt desires and fears, and our usual response is to use our willpower to try to get what we want and to avoid what we don't want. So, given that these have been our habits for at least this life and possibly many lifetimes before, it requires a constant effort to unwind those habits. You have to be continuously aware that there is this press of habit that is trying to keep you doing what you've been doing before. And if you just let go and don't put any effort in, what'll happen is you'll just fall right back into the old habits. So, so the effort is the effort to stay awake, and the effort to refrain from being completely sucked into any of the objects of experience, and to refrain from using your willpower. All those things are difficult, because it'd be like, as I sometimes tell my students, it'd be like as if you've walked around your whole life with a clenched fist, and now someone's saying, well, just unclench your fist. It's so much easier, and the problem is, unclenching your fist is relaxing. It is less effort, but you have the habit of many decades of clenching your fist. So if you want to unclench your fist, it's going to take a while of continuous effort to prevent yourself from clenching it, until such time as it becomes second nature, and then you can let go. But that will happen in its own time. Until that happens by itself, if you just let go, then what will happen is you'll clench your fist again. So that's what I mean by the effort. I hope that's clarifying.
Yeah, actually, very clarifying. Thank you. The fist really helped. The fist really helped. So I think the other thing that I was wondering about, I was kind of just poking around in your website a little bit, and I noticed that you had most recently, that you had been posting specifically about Ramana's 40 verses.
Yes.
So actually, this is what's coming in right now. And this just in, feels like a news bulletin. You had, I just noticed there's this paradox in what you were just describing about the surrender and the attachment and the already being what I am. where's the question in that? The question in that is, maybe I'm just having a dawning at the moment. I don't know. But the question in that is there value in just trusting that if it's to be undone, it'll be undone, rather than putting any effort against it? Will that ever get me there?
So, okay. So actually, it's funny you use that word paradox. I literally talk about this as what I call the seeker's paradox, which is on the one hand, I'm seeking. On the other hand, I'm told I'm already that. So what's the deal? And my suggestion is that seekers have to keep both these things in mind simultaneously, because the truth is they're both partly true, and you could argue partly false. There is something which is going on here, which is, again, like everything connected to the search, not quite entirely graspable by the mind. So yeah, in some sense, what you're saying is, if it's meant to be, it's going to be. That's true, actually, in some deep sense. But at the same time, that would never be my advice to a seeker. My advice to a seeker would be, please do put the effort in, because if it's meant to be, the way it's going to manifest is you're going to put the effort in. And that's going to be the sign that it's meant to be. Now, I mean, people might say, oh yeah, but what about this person or that person who seems to have had some experience miraculously? And to that I can say, I don't know. I mean, maybe they did the work Ramana himself said, if I seem to have accomplished what I accomplished without any prior practice, it must have been the case that it happened in prior lives. So to that, I don't know. I can't speak with any authority. I can only speak from the scriptures about it on these points. I don't pretend to any supernatural insight on what would have happened in past lives as regards practice. But my sense is that effort is, for almost all seekers, would be the right recommendation. And yes, you should keep in mind that you are that. But that should just be a prompt to, there is something elusive about what's going on, 100%, right? There is something which we don't understand. We shouldn't pretend that the practice is a straightforward thing. This is not like going to the gym and just building your muscles or something like that. It's not like a fully scientific endeavor. But, the very practice will itself teach you its mystery. It will unfold itself through you. When you put in the effort, grace will pour through. In fact, even your interest in putting the effort is already grace. Even your interest in the spiritual is already grace. It's grace all the way through. But it will manifest itself through effort. So yeah, I can't agree that it would never be my advice to simply say, if it's meant to be, it's meant to be. That said, I do tell people, right, who are clearly not ready to pursue, the heights of the spiritual path, as I wasn't at many points in my life, to go to something like psychoanalysis, or go where they are at. Everyone is an individual puzzle, and the task is to be as honest as you can be about where you genuinely are, what you genuinely want. And it's not obvious what that is, unfortunately, because we're very complicated beings. But so you only can meet the road, right in front of you, essentially, wherever that is, whatever that is. Not if you're not meant to do inquiry at this point, if you don't feel like doing inquiry at this point or surrender, then you're not going to do it. And nor would it be helpful to say, just do it, because you can't do it. You're not in that position to do it. So what are you in the position to do then? Do what you're in the position to do, which is hopefully to see more and more clearly. It's almost like as you try to struggle to figure out what that is or deal with that, it will become clear. But I recommend all kinds of different things to different people that way. I mean, although self-inquiry and surrender are, as I say, sort of the ultimate techniques in my opinion, but, there's stuff like karma yoga, which is extremely powerful. There's obviously stuff like psychoanalysis. But yeah, there's I'm tempted to give you one more story on this whole point,
Please
which I
do.
really like. So there's a Zen master, a famous Zen master from, I don't, 17th or something like that centuries, a man named Hakuin, who wrote his series of memoirs. And he had very strong opinions. And, he said, oh, the other Zen Buddhists of today, he was a Zen, he was Zen. Other Zen Buddhists of today, they just tell their students to just sit in the monastery and just sit there, basically. and they're like, oh, this is what the great Buddhas of all time have accomplished. You're enjoying that same state. And Akuin's like, this is very misleading. This is not going to help people. And he's like, no, a student should break their head, essentially, something like that. I'm paraphrasing a little, break their head for 18 hours against the koans, until they get that moment of insight, kensho, So his opinion was, this idea of just sitting there and doing nothing is really not that helpful. And he also had opinions about, it's interesting because, again, this is going to be illustrative. He also had negative opinions of, at the time, what were the, I think the Pure Land Buddhists, who still exist today. And I don't know if they believe now what they believed then, but he said, oh, their idea was, it's too hard to accomplish enlightenment for most people. What most people can do, however, is they can chant a mantra. They can chant a mantra, and chanting the mantra, after death, they will go to the pure land of the Buddhas, and there they shall be enlightened, And he's like, again, this is not helpful advice, he said. This is not going to help most people. It becomes just a mechanical thing. This is not really what needs to be done. And he had rationale for it. But he says, oh, there was this one guy, though, he says, who was a Pure Land Buddhist. And he chanted the mantra with such intensity, such devotion, and such continuity that he was enlightened. And so Hakuin says, though I don't recommend it, he says, any path, including Pure Land, which is pursued with sufficient devotion, leads, he says, to Zen. And so I think that's also true, but the point is, that man clearly put in a lot of effort. So if you put in effort, I do believe there's an inner force that will lead you to where you need to go. It will be your teacher, and it will take you on the road to wherever. That the truth is, of course, that's always the case for everybody, regardless, right? Everybody is, in some sense, wherever they can be. They're already doing the best they can. Nothing else is possible. This is all true from a certain sense, but from another sense, seekers must, if they're dissatisfied, which obviously they are, otherwise we wouldn't be seekers, they must exert effort to overcome it.
Thank you for that. So you said that there was lots of other techniques that you point people to. What would you say is the most common tripping point that you see students struggle with?
Yeah, well, the most common tripping point by far is, at least for the people I deal with, and I see there's different communities and populations, I think, and people who might be drawn to my teachings are in many ways often, I find, pre-qualified. They're already interested in Ramana, or they're already interested in non-duality and Advaita. Often they've pursued other things already, and so many of them are already prepared. So I don't know, the population I'm dealing with might be slightly different, but I'm tempted to say that it's the problem of, so when I recommend self-inquiry or surrender at every waking moment, what that does is that it directly sets up a challenge with people's notion that they are the doers of their actions, which is at the heart, very close to the heart of the egoic illusion that I'm the experiencer and I'm the doer. And, in order for things to get done, I need to do them. I need to attend to them. I need to make the decisions. And if I don't make the decisions, they're not going to happen, So when instead the mind is like, well, every time a thought comes up about a decision or something that's going to scare you or that you want or whatever it is, right, to immediately subject it either to inquiry or surrender requires that the mind essentially give up that doership. Or rather, to be clear, to give up the illusion that it is the doer. That's really what it is. They're not, no one is actually the doer, is the truth, but it feels like it is. So what happens is that it's like you're looking over an illusory cliff, but it feels very scary because someone has things that are important to them. A student has a test, a parent has dealing with, an ill family member, or, anything that's important to anybody where it feels like I have to attend to this or this won't get done right. And that could lead to bad things happening, and, to do inquiry or surrender in that moment is to essentially challenge that assumption and be like, well, inquiry would say, for example, well, who has that thought? Who is the I that's going to be afflicted by this so-called bad thing, right? But then the old perspective is like, I don't have time for that right now. I have to fix this. I have to fix this, right? So this is clashed, right? But how could it possibly be? How could it possibly be that things could get done without me is the question. And the reason, of course, that can't be understood by the mind is precisely because the mind almost is that sense of doership, that sense of, so it's standing in the way of it being seen. You can point to how people have in fact done many things without that sense of doership, but it doesn't necessarily convince them in the moment, and they know it, right? Like it's, most things in life, we probably, the way we speak, for example, right? Do we think about every word that comes out of our mouth? Obviously not, right? Things are just coming, right? And we don't summon all the thoughts that come to our brain, the thoughts just come, the feelings just come, the environment just comes, everything just comes. But somehow it feels like in this moment for this thing, I need to do it, which is very inconsistent if you think about it, but most of the things we do. But so in that moment, it's very, very hard because it's very, very close to the egoic illusion to see how it could be done without you. And the reality is that A, it can be done without you, but B, in order for that to be seen, you have to be willing to allow the thing to fail, which means it may not be done. It may not be done. And if it is done, it may not be done, quote unquote, the way you wanted it to be done. So, you have to let the bird potentially fall to the ground and splat if you want it to be able to fly. So that's very scary for people. People are always stopped at that point. But what I find is that for people who are sincere, it's this whole thing is like the waters come and, it's like washing away a mountain, right? So there's things which are softer parts of the mountain and there are harder parts of the mountain. And slowly the waters erode the softer parts first, and then the harder parts soften, and then those parts erode. So it's erodes and erodes and erodes. People aren't able to give up everything immediately, which is totally understandable, but they find themselves being able to give up more and more and more over time, and there's still maybe little islands of really important things to their identity where it's almost impossible for them to, by their own volition, just give it up. But that's okay, it will be taken in time. But that's probably the sticking point, I would say, most people.
Yeah. I could actually viscerally feel the fear that comes up every time the thought of, wait, I'm not doing it. Don't do it. That just, so, and I'm sure you run into that with folks. So when you see somebody in the throes of that fear and they're coming to you, what do I like? The sense almost that I notice is that I kind of want to, okay, let me meditate it away. Is there a self-inquiry I can do that will make it stop? Like, what can I do to make it stop? How do you help people through that? It's still a sense of doership. It's still what it is. How do you guide?
Yeah. I mean, I think it really depends on each person is the truth. It's different for everybody. So for example, right, for some people, what I might say is, okay, first of all, right, there is something about, the interaction itself, right? So my talking with them, and this is true, and not just with spiritual teachers, but a lot of people in helping professions, right? Just the relationship itself is something. And just my listening to them and being there for them in that moment is itself helpful in some way. But Yeah, depending on what's going on. For example, I might tell some people, okay, if you can't do inquiry or surrender in that moment, then do what I call karma yoga, which is okay, go ahead, do the task as normal, meaning go ahead and keep your illusion of doership for that task, let's say, but try to do it with the cultivated attitude of indifference to results. To tell yourself, whether it comes out well or comes out badly, emotionally, I don't care. I'm detaching myself from the results. I'm going to do my best, but I'm detaching myself from the results. This is an attitude you have. So that's helpful in quieting the mind. It's helpful in ultimately coming to the point where you could do inquiry or surrender. So that's one option, right? There might be other options depending, for example, there might be, again, I recommend to a lot of people, I recommend something like psychoanalysis. I might say that may be at work, right? There might be psychological issues from the past that are coming up that are really manifesting this way. So really, I encourage many of my students to get it, and has been helpful for them. So that might be an option. What else? For some people, I think what's required is, for some of my students who've been with me for a while, a reminder of the progress they've made, basically. But people don't realize it because they're in it, right? That, oh my God, like actually, if I look back, a while, actually very different, but in the moment, they're like overcome by darkness and, anger or whatever it is, whatever irritation with themselves about this stewardship thing. So that's a piece. And yeah, there's probably a few other things depending on the person, ultimately, right? Again, to be clear, this whole effort piece is using the illusion of doership, right? So we are accepting that we are doing this thing called surrender or inquiry through our willpower. We are, pretending to anyway. We are, whatever it is that feels like us, we are employing the effort towards inquiry or surrender. Because the idea, as the ancients have put it, is you use a thorn to remove a thorn. You use a thought to burn away thought. And so ultimately, the illusion of doership, you use doership through the practice, and then the illusion is penetrated. Not really. It's ultimately, obviously, a matter of grace to some extent, but yeah. So I don't know if that was helpful. It's sort of it really depends on the person's exact situation, is the real truth.
Yeah, absolutely. But you did point to something that I personally has not fallen into my awareness before, and I heard you say, and I call it karma yoga. Can you talk a little bit about karma yoga?
Yeah,
because I hear
sure.
that and I think I'm doing poses.
Right, sure. Yeah, I mean, I really shouldn't say I call it karma yoga, because the truth of the matter is, it's, I'm really deriving it from the Bhagavad Gita. So and probably other Hindu sources as well. But yeah, this is karma yoga is literally the yoga of action. And in my interpretation of things, which maybe not everybody agrees with me, but my interpretation of it is that it is a way to slowly, through using this sort of attitude of detachment, you can slowly weaken the links between yourself and how concerned you are about how things are going to turn out, essentially. When that's quieted down, it becomes easier to directly turn your attention away from the objects of the world through inquiry or surrender, because that's what they're asking you to do, right? Inquiry and surrender are saying, ignore all that, right? This is a sideshow, right? Look where the magician doesn't want you to look, essentially. So yeah, I mean, this is what is recommended in the Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna. I don't know if people are aware of how aware people are of the Bhagavad Gita here, but basically, Arjuna is asking Krishna for advice about spirituality, and Krishna suggests, Arjuna, go ahead and act, but act with this attitude of detachment. But I believe it is preparatory to, a full turning of the mind away, so again, karma yoga, just to be clear, is I'm going to do it like normal. I'm going to pretend that I'm in control, but I'm going to do it with the attitude that that I'm detaching myself from the results. Inquiry and surrender are saying, okay, you think you have to do this thing? Well, inquiry says, well, who is it that thinks they have to do this? And surrender would say, this is like white noise. I don't care. Like, okay, you've come up. This is irrelevant. You know, I'm not saying yes and I'm not saying no. I'm just treating it as nothing. You know, so they're much more challenging. And I also say, you know, you said, oh, you think yoga and you think poses. Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, the larger use of the term yoga is, of course, you know, just generally speaking, in a way, arguably the entire spiritual search could be called yoga, you know? And so the Yoga Sutras talk about various contemplative practices that include meditation on God, various kinds of, it's not exactly inquiry or surrender, I suppose, but it's its own kind of profound concentrative practice. So karma yoga is, yeah, it's a weird melange. This word is used in many, many different ways in different texts, and I cannot pretend to be a scholarly expert about it. But yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. In America and Europe, probably it mostly is associated with, you know, the physical poses, but actually yoga is in its roots like the entire spiritual affair could be called yoga, you know, in different guises.
Very helpful. Thank you. Very, very helpful. I see a question in the chat. I would like to invite Sina. Would you like to unmic and ask your question? Or would you like me to ask it?
Well, it's just, he already said it, but maybe he could go into it deeper. What is your definition of detachment specifically?
Sure. So detachment would be pretty much having an emotional, I guess you could say, equanimity about the outcome of a certain event, you know, at some level being able to allow it to go whichever way it goes without being overwhelmed one way or the other, you know, and it's in degrees, it's never perfect attachment. And there are all kinds of exceptions that I could say. But basically, when there is detachment from events to a greater extent, the mind becomes quieter, the mind becomes more reflective, and it is equipped with a greater power of concentration to look within. It's not drawn out as much. The resistance to the inward search is not as strong because you're not as bothered by what's going to happen in the outside world. Does that make sense?
I like that. Not as bothered by what's going to happen on the outside world. That's very helpful. So when you find yourself now studying Ramana, let's call it post the last gasp of clarity, which I think were the words you used. What is it that you find most inspiring about the way that he teaches his ideas for achieving clarity, being clear?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I'm mainly, if I look through his stuff, it's often because I want new ways of speaking about this stuff to students of various kinds. I think Ramana is his being comes out in his words, you know, he's such a very pure, simple fabric, you know, it's very sophisticated. It's not sophisticated. He's just so beautifully, you know, just assembled all this complexity into this beautiful simplicity. And so that sort of that simplicity repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats, right? So anywhere you go into his texts, there's a kind of beautiful, simple note that sounds again and again, you know? And I think that sort of incredible consistency of the underlying underlying, being, for lack of a better word, is what strikes me. There's something very authentic, but he's a master. He's not fumbling. There's something very clear, steady, wise, and solid, about what he says wherever he says it, and and consistent. Yeah. So it's that's what I admire.
So how do you think his teachings translate into how we live now in this Western civilization?
I mean, they're very powerful for those who are drawn to them, is what it is. They are incredibly powerful, but only those minds for lack of a better word, karma, or by God's grace, are drawn to them, will find them resonant, and it is said in the Bhagavad Gita, again, even to wish to hear of this teaching, the spiritual teaching of any kind, really, that relates to non-duality, it's a little hyperbolic, but what it says is, it is the fruit of countless lives of meritorious deeds, even to wish to hear this instruction in the first place, right? And there's so many people I've talked to who, very nice, good people, intelligent people who are artistic, people who are admirable in so many ways. But, as far as spirituality goes, it could be like in one ear and out the other. They just aren't touched by it. And that's, in my opinion, their misfortune. But that's just the way it is. And so, so who knows what it means for, our contemporary world. I wouldn't venture a guess, but the truth is the truth, and it is eternal, and it will survive all the winds of change.
Really, really, really beautiful pointing. Thank you. Once again, I just want to invite anyone who feels called to ask questions to feel. Oh, I see a hand already. There we go. Miss Anne.
I don't think I let you finish your sentence. Well, great. Hey, thank you so much for being here. It's a wonderful, wonderful discussion and contemplation. I wanted to ask you about meditation. You've talked about different tools and different, and yet I know from getting acquainted with your work that meditation's a big part of what you feel is part of that package, that constellation. And I just wanted you to, if you could speak as specifically as you can about how you would characterize the most helpful meditations, and then what meditations maybe aren't as helpful. And maybe we can glean from that, kind of hold our practice up against it and see if there's some refinement there.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for the question. So so meditation, I believe, is really, meditations I recommend really are just self-inquiry and surrender. Those are meditations, and so people think meditation, they think sitting practice, formal, routinized sitting practice. And that can be helpful for some people, especially at the beginning stages, or even frankly down the road. I mean, if you want to, it's not a bad thing to do it, but that's not really the, how do I put it? That's not the aim is to engage essentially in meditation of the sorts of, inquiry and or surrender, or some combination of the two, right? At every waking moment, right? As you cook, talk, work, whatever it is you're doing, to continuously be engaged in either the hunt for, how do I know that I am? Where is this information coming from? Where is this feeling in my experience, right? Continuously obsessed, with this, looking, and refocusing. I sometimes give the example with respect to inquiry of, imagine there's a mirror. Now, when you look at a mirror, you're usually, your attention is drawn to the objects reflected in the mirror, right? Whatever they are. Now, suppose I said to you, I want you, instead of looking at the objects, to notice the silvery surface of the mirror itself, the reflective surface. That would be very counterintuitive and unnatural, right? But that's essentially what inquiry is doing to a certain extent. And in the process of noticing the silvery surface of the mirror, what must you do to the objects? Well, you must essentially ignore them, So that would be step one. But here's the step two is as soon as you notice the silvery surface of the mirror, there's a sort of little issue, which is that you notice that the silvery surface, once you have noticed it, is itself an object reflected in another mirror. So what you thought was a silvery surface of the mirror is actually not it. You thought you had it for a second. It glimmered for a second, you might say. And now you're looking at another object. And then you have to repeat the process because now you're looking at a second mirror. So you have to repeat the process and then a third mirror, and you're repeating and repeating and repeating this hunt. So that is meditation. Meditation is concentration. In this case, you are concentrating on hunting this I sense, whatever that is. And it's not one thing because it's a kind of, it wears many disguises. As you hunt it, it changes its form. And so, what you were concentrating on is actually a kind of dynamic process. It's going to educate you about what exactly it is you're doing. In the end, you'll find out you'll be doing nothing at all because what you're hunting is what's always been the case. But that's sort of meant to the end of the quote unquote process. But that is meditation. That's the meditation I'd recommend, or the surrender process, which is the sort of continuous, vigilant, ignoring of all thought and refraining from using willpower, which are almost the same thing, which is again, you're watching and you're trying to just essentially relax, except for the fact that that you are going to be assaulted continuously every second with thoughts that are going to tell you, do this, do that. What should I do now? Go here, go there, right? They're going to try to push and pull you, and your job is to just not use your willpower in response to them, not get sucked into their story, not take what the thoughts are saying as truth, basically. Now, this is not to say that the mind and the body shouldn't act. The mind and the body can act, but they should act without, quote unquote, you. Whatever feels like you will stay out of the fray. And so really, for example, I could view Akilesh as, if I were doing the surrender practice, as 10 feet over there. So Akilesh can deal with the problems of Akilesh's life, whatever they are. He can do or not do as he chooses. But I have nothing to do with him or his life. And so I will remain in a continuous position of chilling, hanging out, essentially, which will require intense effort to stay in that hanging out position, because all the thoughts are saying, come on, you've got stuff to do, but that is a meditation, again, to stay in the continuous waking where you are not absorbed. It's like every second there's a picture being placed in front of you, a photograph, and this photograph is saying, look at me, be hypnotized by me, just be absorbed by me, and your job is to recognize this is just a photograph. Do not let your attention be wholly absorbed by it. It can be in the background. It's no problem, but it can't occupy the full breadth of my attention. It shouldn't be smashed against my eyes, and I shouldn't think it's reality, So that continuous wake up, that continuous, that's surrender, So I refuse to be sucked in to any of these photographs, and I refuse to take the word of the narrative, the thought narrative that's telling me to do this or that. I'm just going to not put in effort. I'm just going to keep not putting in effort. That will take effort to do. It will take effort to not put in effort, because otherwise be sucked in. Those are meditations. Now, all that said, those are the best meditations if you can do them. If you can't do them, and if you can do them continuously or attempt to do them continuously, nobody usually can do them continuously immediately, but the attempts will happen. And as you attempt, you should notice where it is you're having trouble, because where you forget, those are the attachments. It may seem very innocuous, like, oh yeah, I just forgot. No, there's a reason you forgot. You forgot because you got sucked into something, and the sucked into something was something you got sucked into because at some level you care about it for some reason. You may not know why or how, but it's the case. And to start noticing those obstacles will help you start becoming more vigilant, more anticipatory. Like if for example, as for many people, talking to people, when I talk to people, it's really hard to keep up self-inquiry. Well, it's natural because when you talk to people, you care about what they think of you, and you don't want to say something that will make people think you're an idiot or you're unkind, you're inconsiderate or whatever it is, So, but of course, the real question inquiry would ask is, well, who is it concerned about all these things? You have no idea who you are. Why are you concerned about what people think of you? But once you start seeing those obstacles, then you can recognize, I'm going into a conversation with somebody, stay extra aware, because I'm going to be assaulted essentially by a thought that is going to try to suck me in. Okay, so that's the best meditations. But if you can't do that, then the next thing would be to try to do them in a sitting position. And if you can't do that, the next thing would be to try to do any method by which you get some increase in your concentration, right? So yes, if you have to chant a mantra, if you have to focus on your breath, if that's all that you can do, then please, by all means, do it. By hook or by crook, if you can increase the concentration of your mind, that is a good thing. So so there's a whole spectrum of stuff, but the basic meditations that are the most important, in my opinion, are inquiry and surrender. There's no requirement of doing sitting meditation at all if you can maintain inquiry and surrender at all times. Is that helpful?
Yes, very helpful. And what I hear you saying is gauge your need to do sitting meditation by how long you can abide in the, I think Ramana's word was unceasingly question.
Yes.
Just unceasingly. And then when you notice cessation has happened, become real sensitive to that. Maybe there's something to be gleaned there, but don't linger too long, because you're back into to what does this arise? By whom is this seen? And
Yes.
This is just the hunting that you're speaking of.
Absolutely. Or surrender again, which ultimately they come to very, very similar things, right? Because if you're not, a few people, generally speaking, are drawn more to one or the other. So some people have the very curious sort of perspective, like, yeah, who am I? And so for them, inquiry tends to be a more primary method. But for other people, are like, I don't need to know who I am. I just want peace. Okay, well, in that case, you can just ignore everything and relax, and then you have peace. And the reality is they're linked, because ultimately, when you are surrendering, you're ignoring objects. Okay, and when you're inquiring, you are going towards the I. But when you go towards the I, what are you doing towards objects? You are ignoring them, because that's what going towards the I is you're turning away from the objects, hunting what's aware of them. And conversely, in surrender, when you are ignoring the objects and refusing to be drawn in by them, where is your attention necessarily going? It's going towards the I. Where else would it go? So, so these are complementary, but they have different flavors. And again, you can mix and match them. Most people do, I think. But it doesn't really matter in the end. I guess my point is that surrender is a complete path. So, if you are willing to let go of all your worries about how things will turn out and just refuse to be engaged by the things of the world, then there's no issue. So you don't need to, if you're able to do that, you don't even need any questions about who you are, because that will be implicitly answered through the act of surrender.
Yeah, and what wonderful, thank you. And that leads me to just a related question, but I don't want to hog up the questions if someone else has a question. Do you see a question? Rhoda, that was a go? Okay, I saw your finger move. Okay, so this is my other question, and this is what I don't, where does this fit? So, okay, path of surrender, just seeing it, let it go. Oh, I can feel this, let it go. I want to do it, let it go, let it go. what is there a point in where you're in your teaching and in the evolution of your guiding students where we're letting go, and at the same time listening for spiritual intuition?
It's a good question. I think, yeah, I mean, you can always view yourself as listening to spiritual intuition in some sense. It's not really a separate thing that needs to be done, because, when you surrender, really what you're doing is you are, over time, again, these techniques, again, are not, they seem straightforward. In some sense they are, but again, they sort of teach you what they are as you do them. Initially, the view you have of them as you do them changes from what it is later. That's by design. And so the intuition that comes as a result of surrender, I think will ultimately come automatically as a result of the hidden question in surrender. There's a hidden question. The hidden question is, I say ignore everything or ignore all thought. Well, what's a thought? That's the hidden question in surrender, because as you ignore, you have to recognize, well, what is a thought? I'm trying to ignore all thought, but what's a thought, right? So as you do that, you're whether you know it or not, you're digging deeper and deeper and deeper, closer and closer and closer to this, what am I question? And in that process, the mind quiets further and further and further. And this question is followed deeper and deeper and deeper. And then intuition just manifests. I mean, I could say, I sometimes said, people can ask this question. If they like, they can kind of create a hybrid of surrender and inquiry. And they could say, as the mind becomes very quiet, who is the surrenderer, or how to give up the surrenderer, or something like that. You can ask that question. You can also, if you like, simply, if you like, surrender and ignore the idea that you're surrendering, because that's also accurate. The truth is, you think you're doing this thing called surrender effortfully, but the reality is that the self is already in a perpetual effortless state of surrender, meaning you are already effortlessly surrendering. There is the delusion that you are not surrendering. So if you like, you can practice surrender, and then you can remove this idea that there's anything called practice or effort. You can just take that idea, recognize it's delusional, and chuck it. And that's, there's different ways of dealing with it. In the end, ultimately what happens though is, surrender and inquiry will have to cut through the attachments to a certain point. And then when the mind becomes calm enough, the sun will shine in it clearly enough for, intuition to manifest. It's really pretty much a function of the attachments. So there's no real need for your separate effort on listening to spiritual intuition. That listening you'll become capable of that listening when the mind quiets sufficiently. Although I should, again, add this caveat, which a lot of people also have, this is a sort of common question, is when the mind becomes quiet and you start to enjoy some peace, a lot of people feel they should just relax at that point, meaning give up effort. They should give up effort. And I want to emphasize again, that's not the point at which you give up effort, neither in inquiry nor in surrender. You come to that peace, but that peace which you come to, because you've come to it, is an experience. An experience is not the end, because we're not looking for something which comes and goes. An experience which comes can also go. That peace which comes can also go. So, that peace must be itself be the subject of inquiry or surrender. That is to say, inquiry must say, well, who's experiencing this peace? And surrender must say, this peace is also a thought. I'm going to ignore it. I'm not going to be sucked into it, because this is like the most seductive of all the treasures that the mind can provide. So, yeah, that's something to say as well.
Great, thank you.
Sina, go ahead. I see your hand.
Okay, so I've never heard those words quite strung that way, and it's really lighting me up because I can't wait to ask this question, because so many times when I meditate, when I'm by myself, that peace does come, and it even intensifies to something that I would label bliss. And then I hear masters. I think maybe even Ramana Maharshi has said this term, and I could be wrong, not a scholar, but there's a term, Sat Chit Ananda. Don't know if I'm saying that right, but I know Ananda means bliss. So there's a lot of times when I'm meditating and this comes. And so you probably know what I'm going to be asking. Who is my next step in this journey? To discover that bliss too is a thought, and that's also a treasure of the mind, just like you just said, this piece is also a thought, and that I need to inquire, well, who's aware of this bliss?
Yes, exactly.
Is that
yes.
it?
That's absolutely right. Yes. You know, it's I sometimes just give this analogy, you know, it's like you have a big lake, okay, suppose, okay, and the lake is reflecting faraway objects and it's reflecting nearby objects. Faraway objects might be like mountains, clouds, you know, faraway trees and things like that. And the nearby objects are like, let's say, include, you know, you, okay? And so the spiritual process of inquiry or surrender has sort of two pieces to it. The first piece, which is 99.9% of it really, is to turn the mind from the many things to the few, which is basically turning them from the faraway objects to the nearby objects, right? Sucking in the diffuse rays of the attention and concentrating them into a laser beam, okay? So when you turn your attention from the faraway and the many things to fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer things, you find there kindly comes a point, it might be just for a little while, where you finally are on the reflection, not of the mountains and the clouds, but of your face, okay? This might be analogized to the bliss or the peace that you're talking about. It's the reflection of your face, but it's just a reflection. That's the thing. It's not the self, it's a reflection. So there's a second piece, which is now you have to do something which is different, which is you can't just go from the many to the few. There's a jump that has to be made to recognition that, oh, this is my face. And when you recognize me, you can't force this to happen. All you can do is keep asking, let's say an inquiry, or keep surrendering and surrender until grace implants that recognition or whatever, you know, but the point is that recognition, once there's clarity about that, you won't need to look in the mirror of the lake to know it. So we don't want to be dependent on having to look at our reflection to know that we are what we are. So now you also mentioned Satchidananda, by the way. So yeah, that's you know, I could give a long talk about that alone, but the Ananda there, right? You should know, right? So it is bliss, but it is that bliss, which is, it's a little bit misleading. It's that bliss which encompasses all states of experience, including states of non-bliss. So all experience is in some profound sense bliss. Now, what does that mean? It means, like, okay, the example I always use is, it's like watching a sad movie, okay? So you watch a sad movie, the movie is sad, but if it's well put together, it's well directed, it's well acted, it's well written, you know, it's beautiful, it's a work of art, you know? So there's a bliss there, even though the actual emotions that you might feel when you watch this movie are sadness. You might feel sadness, you might feel anger or injustice or whatever it is, but still there's an artistic element in the creation of these things. So it's not just watching a happy movie or even a happy moment in a sad movie. It's you know, that happiness is only just a state, whereas the real bliss, with the bliss of Satchidananda, is encompassing the opposites of happiness and unhappiness both in something which is blissful, but it's blissful in an aesthetic way, you might say. So yes, bliss is relevant, but bliss is that reflection. Bliss is the reflective, it's the real bliss reflected in the mind then becomes a state, and it becomes a state of bliss, which is what you get when the mind is intensely focused, right? On anything, by the way, not just necessarily the spiritual, right? When people have so-called flow states, right? when they're intensely involved in any activity, like a musician or an actor or anyone doing any job, really any kind, which they're really involved and passionately involved in, and the mind becomes incredibly focused for that moment, right? There's bliss of a sort. And that's because what happens is the mind is becoming very, very still as a result of the concentration. And it's then reflecting, but only for a moment, some aspect of the self, basically. But we can't rely on that. We can't be satisfied with just an aspect, because it'll go away, as I'm sure you've seen. So it goes, yeah. So we can't allow that to be the end of it. We have to say, whose bliss is it? You're muted, by the way, but I know what you're saying.
That was very helpful. I think I could see Sina saying that was, it sounds very much like the way you're describing that bliss is everything, like love is everything. It's the same sort of translation, I think, is what I understand you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah. I cannot even believe there's only 1 minute left. So I would like to just ask if you have any events coming up, or is there anything you'd like to point us to that you might be interested in?
I really should have stuff to point you to. Truth be told, I do not really have anything to point you to, except my website. And yeah, I'm working on a third book. We'll see. We'll see when that happens. And I feel like I intend to, we'll see if this happens as well. I don't put more. Right now, most of my work is one-on-one with people. I might do more group stuff in the future, but that's yeah. So thank you so much for the offer, but really I have nothing to point to right now in terms of resources or events or anything like that, except my website.
Fabulous. Well, Sina has posted your website again for anyone who's interested. You also have a couple of books. So if anyone is interested, I believe we can get those from your website. Is that correct?
Absolutely right. They're on Amazon and a bunch of other places, but you can find where they're located on my website. And I put out YouTube videos every so often. So if you subscribe to my mailing list, then you'll find out when those are posted as they're posted.
Fabulous. And I also noticed that you are doing contemplations of Ramana's 40.
Yes. Yes. So I'm writing commentary on that, and I'm releasing. I'm about halfway through it, or a bit more than halfway through at this point. So I'm releasing that commentary as well. Yes.
So lots of resources at siftingtothetruth.com. So if you're interested and want to learn more, please do join us there. Akilesh, thank you. This was a delightful evening. Thank you everyone for being here. And
thank you all very, very much for having me. I really appreciated being here.
It was a pleasure. Have a great night.
Thank you. Take care.
Good night, everyone.